The Rebel Capitalist Show.
All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone back to the Rebel Capitalist Show. He is my good buddy and my partner with this legal action against the Fed. His name is Robert Barnes. Robert, welcome back to the Rebel Capitalist Show, my friend.
Glad to be here.
All right, so it's the question on everyone's mind. What's going on with this FOIA request that we've got in the works here? Give us an update.
Sure. So we have a forensic auditor who basically spent most of his life auditing banks. And so the goal and the objective is going to be to basically audit, to be able to audit the Fed and then ultimately to sue the Fed. We need to know what information we want requested. The more specific it is, the better. So the part of the process is having the detailed information of specific records we want located in specific places concerning specific matters. So
Right.
He's working with that aspect of the team.
Got
and
it.
the legal aspect is making sure not only which banks and which locations and where the records are stored and making sure the legal formality of the request are made, but also making sure that the Fed's more recent changes in their FOIA rules, that we get around those changes in the FOIA rules to make sure that doesn't block us either. So basically, we're in the process of drafting the legal FOIA documents to send to the different parts of the Fed to get the specific records. That will trigger the very first part of the process. So we're in that stage now.
Okay, and you touched on something that I completely forgot about, but I'd love to get your thoughts on, and that's like a week after we announced this. And for those of you who might be lost right now, I think most of my viewers know what we're talking about, but about a month ago, we decided to take legal action, or at least start the process by requesting documents through the federal, the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA is what they call it. And you and I set up a GoFundMe campaign. You're taking the legal side. I put in the first 25,000 and I matched it dollar for dollar until we got up to $100,000, which gives us the money for this first round of legal action to try to audit the Fed eventually. And so that's kind of what we're getting an update on right now. And just FYI, if you didn't know, we got up to that $100,000 mark in less than 36 hours. So that was really, really great to see everyone's enthusiasm for this campaign. But about a week after we made that public, you text me and you're like, wait a minute, I think they might know what we're doing, or they might have got wind of it. Can you walk us through what happened?
Sure. So what happened is the Federal Reserve, it was actually someone that followed the channel, put up a YouTube video alerting me to this and said, by the way, within a week after our announcement went viral, the Federal Reserve suddenly announces that it's going to change its FOIA rules for how it responds to Freedom of Information Act requests. These are just legal, they're just trying to put up various hurdles and barriers and various potholes to make it trickier and more difficult. The core of the Freedom of Information Act still applies. The core of the constitutional requirements and the case law still applies. So their ability to evade responsibility and accountability ultimately is unavailing. They're just trying to make it procedurally more difficult. And the nature of the rule amendments did appear to be in direct response to what we were planning on doing, because it was trying to put more hurdles in the process, make us go through a few more barriers, get around a few more things, but have done this many times over the years. We're still going to get the records. They're just trying to create as many headaches as possible in the process.
Yeah, now we have no proof of that, of course, but the timing does seem
and the substance.
Suspicious.
The substance was like designed to make our case in particular more difficult. So it could be purely coincidental, but with the Fed, it's never safe to assume coincidence is the likely explanation.
Right. Now, I've had a few people on Twitter respond and say, oh, you're just wasting your time because the Fed's going to change the rules or something like that. And I've tried to point out that there has been groups that have gotten information from the Fed successfully under the Freedom of Information Act before, specifically those Bloomberg reporters in 2009 and 2010. So there is a legal precedent for what we're doing. We're not just kind of pushing on a rope or pissing in the wind, if you will. Can you walk us through that?
Precisely. So what happened was the Fed for a long time would play sort of hide and go seek with their records. So they would take certain records, and if they thought they were problematic, they would stick them with the individual banks, the individual constituent members, the individual boards like the New York or wherever, and consequently say, well, that's not subject to FOIA, even though it's our records, really. We're just storing them in a different location. So Bloomberg was the one to start out suing over everything that happened in 07 and 08 related to the financial crisis. And ultimately, the court ruled in the Bloomberg reporter's favor. They said, no, you can't take records under the Freedom of Information Act created as a federal agency and say, well, really they were created by or stored by or prepared for some other group within your Federal Reserve or part of or constituent component of, and thereby hide your records. And subsequent cases followed up on that, reaffirmed that in multiple courts. So what was amazing was after that big win against the Fed, nobody else went and did much with it. So there were two big wins, and then it was like they just lost interest in the Fed. And so no one has followed up on these precedents, but the precedents are clear and they have not been changed at all. And this was really the way the law always was. I've litigated this in a wide range of other contexts. Agencies play this game all the time. They try to find every shenanigan imaginable to get around the law, but the law was designed to be expansive and protective. So that gets to the second part of it. The bottom line is if it's a federal government agency at any level or somebody doing federal governmental work, they have to keep, store, and make available their records, which is a wide range of records under the Freedom of Information Act. This is what the Hillary Clinton emails were all about. She was trying to keep those away from FOIA requests by sticking them in her bathroom instead of on the State Department server to do all that Clinton Foundation business. The only way you get out of it really is to claim you weren't doing government authorized work. And that's really where the second trap is. If they claim they don't have these records, that means that the work is being performed in a manner that they admit is not authorized by law. And that sets up our second strategy of lawsuits, which is that they're acting outside of their jurisdiction and authority. So the goal is to create a trap for them where they either give us the records so that we can really audit the Fed, or they admit that what they're doing is outside their authority. They're still stuck in that trap under existing law. Creating procedural shenanigans in the process just gives us a few more headaches and annoyances, but doesn't stop the ultimate objective.
Okay, got it. Well, I think that's perfect as far as the update. We've got a summary there. Now let's move on to some other topics that are really hot right now, something I've been thinking about, and that is, and I'm sure YouTube is going to have a problem with this video, but it is what it is, the vaccine passport. And, you're right in the mix. I'm sure you've given this a lot of thought. What is going on? Oh, I'd like to get your thoughts on it first and foremost, and then try to dissect it from a legal standpoint. I mean, how does this work at a state level, at a federal level, or with individual businesses?
I think there's multiple problems with it because it goes back to the Nuremberg Code in 1947. Everybody agreed the age of governmental experimentation on human beings was over. That because the Nazis had taken what the U.S. was doing with eugenics and forced sterilizations and involuntary medical experimentation, like what was taking place in Tuskegee with the syphilis experiments and other aspects, mustard gas in World War I, and said no more. That we now see what this looks like. We now see how this can rebound, how the moral horror of what the Nazis did. Japanese also did it as well with various biological weapon experiment camps in China. And we said, this is never going to happen again. And we established as a principle of international law that you cannot force anyone to take any medical drug or medical treatment without their informed consent. That just became the established rule, period. And now we're the vaccine passports, mandatory vaccines, conditioning employment or education or travel, all of which have constitutional rights to property or liberty implicated. All of that is now being put in jeopardy by these vaccine passports and forced vaccines. And in my view, it's a direct assault on the Nuremberg Code. And we're going back to the 1920s. We're going back to the Connie Buck era, where the Supreme Court greenlit forced sterilizations, one of the most morally horrendous decisions in our constitutional history. A decision that led to Korematsu, where we end up with forced detention camps simply based on ancestry, deprivation of all your rights to property and liberty. They're trying to restore that old order that was based on a Jacobson decision, which was the first one to ever say you could do anything about requiring vaccines. And I call it the trilogy of infamy. 3 horrendous decisions that stripped Americans of their core constitutional liberties. And we recognize that the Buck decision and the Korematsu decision are morally horrendous decisions that are abhorrent to the Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Court has acknowledged that. And yet now we're trying to restore that again and go back to that day and age of a system where the white lab coats get to tell everybody what to do and how they do it. So that's the core problem. The Nuremberg Code, constitutional liberties, that's the core problem with any level of government requiring vaccines as a condition of employment, education, travel, or rights. Beyond that,
well, state or federal,
all of them, state and federal. Okay. This is a core constitutional liberty that applies at every level of United States government. In my view, the Nuremberg Code applies to every government in the world. And our courts in the United States have recognized the Nuremberg Code is enforceable in the United States against state actors. In my view, it's enforceable against every government worldwide that's a signatory to any aspect of it, or to be bound by international law. So that's part one. Part two, specific to the United States, is the Anti-Discrimination Act against the disabled actually covers this kind of situation. If an employer thinks you are sick or treats you as someone who's having a medical condition and doesn't allow you employment or reasonable accommodation, if you're a public accommodation, restaurant, bar, things of that nature, based on a perceived disability, and not taking the vaccine is clearly a perceived disability, then they have to make reasonable accommodation, or it has to be essential to your job for them to discriminate against you. So to me, these efforts of employers and educational institutions and public accommodations are violating the laws that protect against discrimination based on perceived health status, because that's really what disability is. It's bigger than disability. So I think all of these people are doing that.
Can't they say it's relevant to your job, though, because of the perceived negative health consequence, or spreading, let's say, the pervasive sickness to their their customers, whether it's in a restaurant, in an airport, in a plane, something like that?
Well, I had a big debate with Alan Dershowitz on this, because he's more of a fan of the vaccines. And my argument was, and he ultimately agreed, the legal standard would be the same either way, constitutionally, Nuremberg Code, or under the Anti-Discrimination Act involving disability, which is you need clear and convincing evidence that not taking the vaccine poses a substantial risk of severe harm to others. It can't be just harm to yourself. The problem is there's only been one case so far in the United States, or as far as I know, anywhere in the world, that's tested the evidentiary basis for that theory, or any version of that theory. And that was in the Western District of Pennsylvania before Judge Stickman, about whether the lockdown orders met those requirements. And he said they didn't even get close to meeting the requirements. Now, you dig into the records, they don't have any evidence supporting this. So, for example, what's the clear and convincing evidence of substantial risk that a person that doesn't take the vaccine will transmit it to others and is likely to cause them severe bodily harm? Well, they won't, as you pointed out recently, the most stunning thing about everything related to this pandemic policy response, public health interventions, is the complete lack of any cost-benefit analysis, of any risk assessment. What that tells you is, do we really think that nobody's done it? Or is it the case they've done it and the data looks bad? So as like Dershowitz agreed, if there was only a 1% risk that you would cause someone else severe bodily injury by not taking the vaccine, he didn't think that was high enough to meet the substantial risk requirement under the law. And like this has been tested out in the disability area, because people will say, well, this particular condition is going to cause me this problem. And what the judges will say is, well, you need to show substantial risk and evidence, and that evidence has to be clear and convincing. They usually can't find it. You need something like a 10%, 20%, 30% risk that by not taking the vaccine, you're going to transmit, and there's no other accommodation other than the vaccine, that you're going to transmit the disease in such a way that it's going to likely kill somebody else. The first problem is, if you know you have COVID, there's a reasonable accommodation. You simply lock yourself down until you don't have it. until like the 2-week, 3-week time period passes. So that means the only risk the vaccine purports to solve is the risk of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission. The problem is all the data shows that is extremely rare. In other words, you have to have COVID, not know you have COVID, and transmit it in order for it to be and transmit it to someone who it's going to cause severe bodily harm to. So if you look at
and a lot of the studies show or are inconclusive as to whether or not you can transmit it if you've already taken the vaccine.
Exactly. That's the second problem. So problem one is just the probability of pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic risk is very low. In part because people who are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic simply don't have the level of viral load needed to transmit it in the first place. Right. And there was a lot of hype about that early on, but all the historical data says influenza-type viruses rarely transmit from asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, as you note, the vaccine doesn't solve that problem. The vaccine simply reduces your viral load, but you can still transmit almost just like a pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic person. So problem one is there isn't a substantial risk of you transmitting it to someone else that's going to cause severe bodily harm in a pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic state. Second is that the vaccine doesn't really meaningfully reduce that risk. At least there's been no evidence produced of it. And that's the problem that they have. I don't believe they can meet the evidentiary standard necessary. Now, there is a third component unique to this vaccine, which is this vaccine is an EUA vaccine, emergency use authorized vaccine. Under federal law, this means it has not met the relevant standards for the FDA to say this is a safe vaccine.
Right.
Because that usually requires years. Because particularly here, you're talking about a vaccine for coronavirus. We've never had a successful long-term vaccine for coronaviruses. Number two, you're looking at using mRNA. You're using a new technology. This is the first ever mRNA vaccine. It may turn out to be wonderful and great. It may turn out to have unexpected problems. And just look at 1976. We rushed the swine flu vaccine. The vaccine ended up causing 10 times more harm than the swine flu pandemic did. People can look up 60 Minutes. Back when 60 Minutes did real news, they actually did a whole breakdown on what a disaster it was. And this was back in,
what was it? What year was that, Robert?
1976.
Huh. Okay.
So what happens is YouTube keeps trying to bury it, and people keep re-uploading. It's the power of the internet. They keep sticking up the red pills, and so all you got to do is look up 60 Minutes swine flu vaccine, some combination, it will come up. Even if YouTube's algorithm is trying to bury it. It's old Mike Wallace doing it, talking about what a complete disaster the whole thing was. Huh. And this is why some of the Trump critics are actually right. Rushing a vaccine historically has been a bad idea. I mean, there's people to this day that believe that the attempts to rush a polio vaccine in the Belgian Congo may have been the source, at least in part, of the AIDS virus. Because they were using particular monkeys they weren't supposed to use. That there's an incredible correlation. There was a book called The River. There was a French and later English documentary on the subject. This guy did like 10 years of studies. And what it is the guy was just in a rush. And the Belgian Congo in 1959 was not a fun place to live. That was another place where we did forced vaccines. They said, you can come and get your kid vaccinated with this experimental vaccine, or we'll come and beat you tomorrow. I mean, the Belgian Congo is where they used to cut off people's hands if they didn't work the rubber trees enough. This is Lord Conrad's Heart of the Jungle. He went there thinking it was this beautiful missionary land, the way the Belgian king was selling it. He got there and saw what state power looks like when it's raw and monopolized. And so we have bad experiences when we rush vaccines. We have bad experiences when we use novel vaccines. So we have a novel vaccine with a novel coronavirus. So to deal with this precise risk, federal law says that if the vaccine is only authorized for distribution as an emergency vaccine, then it cannot be compelled on anybody. It says without informed consent, that there can't be any requirement. So anybody that's requiring it is violating the specific terms of federal law. Now, this law has never been adjudicated in court before because no one's ever tried this. No one has ever tried to mandate, force, or coerce or condition access to benefits on an emergency vaccine. Least of all, an emergency vaccine that has novel technology for a novel virus like this one is. But that's why the law is there. So I think any of these mandates and vaccine passports also violate that set of laws. Last but not least, you do have a bunch of states that are banning these laws. So you might be able to have a claim under state law if somebody's trying to require it.
Wow, that's really fascinating, and kind of the overlays with history, or the resemblance to what we've seen in the past is just shocking. Yes. That you just, especially in today's day and age, you just have to be a student of history to really have an appreciation and an understanding as to what's going on, and the downside to what we're doing by giving the government all of this power over our lives in the sake of, or for the sake of just perceived safety. Well, and I want to be very clear too. We're not saying that businesses should or shouldn't have the right to, force their employees to do X, Y, and Z. That's a completely a different topic of discussion. We're just talking about the actual law right now. So moving on, let's talk about the wealth tax, something that's very popular in the mainstream media, and not just the United States with Elizabeth Warren and other politicians on the left, but also a lot of different countries in the developed world. I mean, I've heard New Zealand talking about it, Australia talking about it. Pretty much the only countries in the West that aren't talking about it are the European countries that have already given it a try and found that it doesn't work at all. But then also, I want to get your thoughts on that from a legal standpoint in the United States. But then also, what I've heard California talking about, which is an unrealized capital gains tax.
I mean, and that last part was going to be inevitable. I was telling people that, that one solution is this attempted, modern monetary theory and just print a lot of cash and see how that works. But some governments, of course, around the world, as the Colombians are seeing, can't do that practically.
Right.
So ultimately, the only this is all about state control, whether it's state spending, state lockdowns, vaccine passports. It's all about the state having more power in its own hands. And and taxation is a natural extension of that. So why? Because that's all taxation really is. I remember, once they did the Federal Reserve, years later, a guy did a speech and he was like, well, we can print money as much as we want. We really don't need taxes to put money into circulation or to get money. We use taxes now for its power of surveillance, for its power of control, for its power to dictate people's behavior. Right. So they were always going to go down that path. And then for some governments, they have to, because printing is not a solution. It's still open question whether printing is a solution here. But, to me, enough people are under that impression that that's not the real reason for their confiscatory tax expectation. The other aspect is the attempts to shut down international tax loopholes by treating all corporations somehow, wherever they make money, as having a global tax.
So, I wanted to get your opinion on that, because I've heard Janet Yellen discuss this, how we need a global standard minimum for corporate taxes. And I think that would obviously just evolve into a global minimum for income tax as well.
That's where they're going. Their goal is to prevent tax havens anywhere in the world,
right?
And to have sort of uniform, almost it's becoming like one central government. And you have one central government that collects all the taxes and then decides how it distributes amongst its constituent parts, the independent now independent countries. And the same, I think, ultimately is going to be happening with spending. And it's probably a step to one currency being one global digital currency. Replacing the current reserve currencies based on the problem. They'll use the pretext as a pretext. The problems currently with the dollar as a reserve currency and everything related to it that you've gone into great detail on. But so I think that's where they're going legally. Now they have major problems. One is most governments do not allow taxation of their citizens outside of their territory. The U.S. government's one of the only ones that do that.
Right.
And that's why the Canadians and the Irish and the English dominate in the Caribbean. You would think it'd be a bunch of U.S. people down there, but it's because if you're U.S., you still get taxed if you're in the Caribbean. So that's why, there's the Puerto Rico thing, but that's its own thing. That's why it's dominated by them. So one problem they have to overcome is getting other countries to use the U.S. system that says it doesn't matter where you are or where you made the money, that we can still tax you.
Right, right.
They got to get over that hurdle. Second hurdle, at least under U.S. law, tax treaties are the law of the land. So they're part of the Constitution. It's why Congress can't change a tax treaty. The IRS can't change a tax treaty. They have to get the other country to change the treaty. And the reason why that's significant is most of the real corporate tax loopholes in transfer pricing and intellectual property and captive insurance, many of them are based on tax treaties. And Congress can't change that. Yellen can't change that. The Treasury can't change that. The IRS can't change that. They have to change the treaty itself. So that's why she's talking so much about trying to use leverage to force governments to not only agree to a global minimum tax, but they really need to change their own constitutions and our treaty with them on how taxation occurs. So that will be the first big loophole, big threshold to cross.
That's good to hear that at least there's some sort of legal pushback that might slow this down or prevent it from happening altogether.
Oh, absolutely. It's a major hurdle for them to overcome. The third part is domestically with a wealth tax. I mean, the easiest place for them to go will be just to treat all income the same. And that they're basically going to do. I mean, the capital gain, talking about a capital gains rate of 43, 45, whatever it is, you add that to what the states like California and New York are going to do, you're going to be back to 1950s tax rates. But the difference, when all the left talks about, oh, look at how great the 1950s tax rates were, there were so many loopholes, nobody paid that rate.
Right.
They're going to try to make this a real 50, 60, 70% rate. So that's going to change the ball game entirely.
Yeah, and I want to point out there, Robert, the proof to what you're saying is if you just look at the tax receipts as a percentage of GDP, you'll notice in the 40s and the 50s, and when all the Krugman say are these fabulously great times for the middle class because our tax rates were so high, you notice that the amount of tax revenue as a percentage of GDP was pretty much identical to what it was in the 1980s when Reagan dropped it down to whatever it was, 25%.
Precisely. I mean, and in fact, even Carter was talking about cutting taxes at the end of the 70s. First tax cut that went through was 78 because there was bipartisan recognition that the inflationary effect on the tax rates had caused unintended deleterious economic effects. So, but the next place, now I think at a constitutional level on the United States, they cannot pass a wealth tax without amending the Constitution.
Okay.
You cannot tax property. That's the reason why we don't have a federal property tax, because all that is right now, any tax passed with an internal tax passed by Congress has to be uniform, has to meet certain apportionment requirements, unless it can be labeled an income tax under the 16th Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court came in and said the definition of income tax has to be limited. It can't be whatever Congress wants it to be. Right. Otherwise, it negates the purpose of the amendment. And they've basically limited it and said you can only tax gain separate from property and labor. You can't tax property and labor itself. Now, the IRS has long held a different position. 1934, an IRS commissioner told Congress, people shouldn't complain about what we do tax. They should be happy about what we don't yet tax. They even proposed taxing people for making food in their own kitchen. They said that's really labor that we should stick a wage value on and make them pay a tax for cooking your own food. That was the place they wanted to go. They're going to reinvigorate some of those concepts because the most hated tax at the time of the revolution was the head tax. It was taxing you just for existing. The second most hated tax was a tax on your farmland. But the most hated tax was the head tax, which is one of the oldest forms of English taxation. And so the goal was you can't tax me just for living. And that's why it has to be something gains separated from property and labor. Right. But they're going to try to attack that. But constitutionally, they can't. The X factor is always, does the U.S. Supreme Court uphold that? I think they will. I think they will say a wealth tax is unconstitutional. But it won't stop them from trying, and there's no guarantee the Supreme Court says that.
Okay. So I know we're running a little short on time, and I've got to get your opinion on this or an explanation, because this is something I've read frequently over the last couple months, and I just cannot understand what the rationale is here. And whenever I read something about the eviction moratoriums, it's always saying that the entity that has power and control over this is the CDC. And it's like the CDC is extending the eviction moratorium until June, or the CDC is doing this. And I'm thinking to myself, how on earth does the CDC have anything to do with an eviction moratorium, let alone complete control over it? Can you explain that to me?
It's like something right out of the X-Files in the mid-'90s.
Yeah.
Where it's going to be the CDC and FEMA were going to organize under the guise of an Ebola outbreak to steal all our liberties and rights and set up camps and assert universal control. And now we have like 90% of that actually occurring. So the CDC's authority is that they have authority to basically like fumigate properties, things like that. So that their control over land and property was solely when you had a health emergency in that property that required some sort of emergency federal treatment. The CDC, to control infections, had authority to go in and fumigate it or do something specific to that infected, plagued property. Okay. It has never been claimed that meant they had the rights to govern all residential landlord rental contracts in the entire nation.
Right.
And that's why a federal court, some smart people sued. The court sat on it to allow it to sort of get its political benefit for the CDC, but then came in and ruled the obvious, said this is clearly unconstitutional. The CDC has no authority, in a violation of the statute. It says CDC has no authority to regulate landlord-resident contracts at any time. Its only authority is specifically to remediating a property, fumigating a property, things of that nature. That's it. The guys that, maybe if somebody's evicted, then they'll lead to them spreading the virus. And thus the CDC can now regulate every landlord contract. Never was what the law allowed.
So how do we still have the moratorium then?
The moratorium has been struck down and has been enjoined as of about a week ago. And it was done nationwide. But
I didn't know that. Okay.
Needless to say, the CDC hasn't been anxious to share that with everybody. So, they still have an opportunity to appeal, and they may do that just to buy time. The CDC has admitted by June, they're not even going to claim the authority anymore. So in all likelihood, it's really already done and dead, but it will definitely be dead by June. They're just not broadcasting the results of that court case. And the media didn't broadcast the results of that court case.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's something that we really need to think through the economic ramifications of how that will play out. Because I was just assuming that Biden, through the CDC, was just going to keep kicking that can down the road and extending it and extending it and extending it. Therefore, what does that mean for demand for consumer goods? Because all of these renters have a lot more purchasing power. What does that mean for the landlords who aren't getting their rent? But now we've got to, I think I'm going to have to look at it from a different lens, and that this is definitely coming to an end. So how does that impact the U.S. economy? Okay, so that's great to know. Okay,
and not only that, I think all the tenants, whatever protection they thought they had from the CDC order, is now gone because it was never lawful. So whatever amounts were due, whatever interest is due, what other fees are due, all of that accumulation, if they relied upon the CDC, they turned out to be mistaken.
Okay. Robert, for my viewers and listeners who want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
Two places. If you want legal information, or you need to inquire about a case, or you're looking like maybe it's time to do an exit out of the country before you're taxed into oblivion, as some smart people are doing, then BarnesLawLLP.com, where there's a contact page and you can contact me. Otherwise, for a lot of political and legal and exclusive content, I do that at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Okay, cool. And I also want to point out that you are going to be speaking at Rebel Capitalist Live June 11th through the 13th in Miami. We're really looking forward to that. And we've got about 20, maybe 25 tickets left. So if you're thinking about going, I would suggest you get over to rebelcapitalistlive.com right now and make sure you get a ticket before they're sold out. Robert, can't wait to see you in Miami, my friend.
We'll be there.
Hi, guys. I'd like to invite each and every one of you to join me in Miami this June 11th through the 13th for Rebel Capitalist Live, the investment conference. And this is not over Zoom. This is face-to-face. I'm bringing a lot of your favorites from the Rebel Capitalist Show to Miami under one roof to speak, to give you the knowledge you need to increase your personal freedom, to become a better investor and make larger returns over the next few years when we have this financial uncertainty that's being caused by the Fed and the government. And finally, it's going to give you an opportunity to really take your understanding of macroeconomics and the world around us to the next level. We've got some incredible speakers lined up that are going to completely blow you away. People like Mike Maloney, Jason Hartman, Ken McElroy, Lynette Zhang, Mark Moss, Brent Johnson, Jeff Snyder, just to name a few. The tickets for this event are really going to sell out fast, so make sure you go to Rebel Capitalist Live right now to get all the details and to reserve your spot. We need to come together as a group, as a community, especially after what we dealt with in 2020 and 2021, so we can learn how to build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. And we need to do this as a group, as a community of fellow rebel capitalists. So don't waste any time. Head over to rebelcapitalistlive.com, and I will see you in Miami.